All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to the webinar that we're having tonight on the future of Alberta's Grizzlies. It's co-hosted by the Pre-Veterinary Students Association, which is a club at the University of Calgary, and the Cochrane Ecological Institute. And a special welcome to members of the government, U of C faculty, and international registrants joining us tonight. My name is Sarah, and I'm the president of the Pre-Veterinary Students Association. I'm here with Alex, who's vice president of events, and she helped organize this tonight. So I'll just give a little bit of an introduction of the Pre-Veterinary Students Association. We're a club that exists to bring together and provide resources for people who are interested in veterinary medicine and other animal related careers. So this seminar is pretty relevant. Lots of things with conservation can be applicable to vet med or other related careers. So we're really excited to be co-hosting this webinar tonight and learning about grizzly conservation and rehabilitation. Yeah, really excited to learn about it. Now I'll introduce Jasmine, who's a member of the Pre-Veterinary Students Association and a volunteer at the Cochrane Ecological Institute, and she had a really big role in organizing the seminar tonight.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Ngu. I'm the current communications team lead at Cochrane Ecological Institute. So I'll be moderating the question and answer period at the end of today's webinar, as well as introducing our presenters today, Clio, Smeeton, and Ken Weagle, who are the directors of CEI. At the end, we may be joined also by Lisa Dalsny, conservation biologist, who may be also helping to answer some of the questions at the question and answer period. So the Cochrane Ecological Institute, or CEI, was founded in 1971 by Clio's parents, internationally known explorers, Miles and Beryl Smeeton. Since its beginning, CEI has implemented many successful projects, most notably its 39-year-long swift fox conservation program, working with the Blackfeet Nation of Montana and the Kainai tribe of Southern Alberta. CEI successfully reintroduced the swift fox, formerly extinct in Canada, to its historic habitat. To date, over 1,000 swift foxes have been reintroduced to the wild through this program. Over the years, CEI has rehabilitated and released countless animals back into the wild, including moose, deer, foxes, owls, hawks, and bears. Today we'll be focusing on one very special species in particular, the grizzly bear. Current regulation in Alberta stipulates that bears are not allowed to be rehabilitated. Some, however, have been granted special permission for rehabilitation, but these bears are required by law to be released before an arbitrary date in mid-October annually, often regardless of whether the bears are mature enough to be reintroduced to the wild. This was the case of Charlie and Masqua, two bears CEI had the opportunity to rehabilitate. Both were released before the 18 to 48 months of age recommended by bear conservationists. When bears are released at mature ages, they are more likely to stay away from humans. At the moment, regulations also stipulate that bear cubs be returned to where they were found. This poses obvious and significant risks to animals found near human settlements. And as a result of this regulation, in addition to his youth, Charlie was shot and killed by a landowner a short while after his release, when he ventured too near someone's house. Thankfully, Masqua was returned to the remote area where she was found, and she continues to live in the wild to this day. This brings us to today's topic, grizzly rehabilitation and conservation in Alberta. In their presentation, Clio and Ken will guide you through the current regulations surrounding bear rehabilitation in Alberta and the importance of improving these policies to preserve Alberta's bear populations for generations to come. So without further ado, I will now pass the mic over to Clio and Ken for their presentation. So just get your video pinned here.
Are we on yet?
Okay. Yes, there you are.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ken Weagle of, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I'm Ken Weagle of the Cochrane Ecological Institute, and this is...
I'm Clio of the same outfit.
We've been working with rehabilitation of wildlife for many, many years now, and in the recent years, we have come up with an idea that we're pursuing actively for the rehabilitation and release of orphaned and possibly injured grizzly bear cubs in Alberta. And I'll just move on into our presentation now, if I can figure out. I mean, these are two, near 80-year-olds fighting with technology that we never dreamed of in our youth. So please bear with us. But anyway, we've been given wonderful lessons by the students of the University of Calgary, and hopefully we get through it. Anyway, Cochrane Ecological Institute is, as Jasmine said, was formed. Actually, our first permit was obtained in 1967, which was a game farm permit from the municipality of Rocky View. And then it migrated into different things over the years and gradually to Cochrane Ecological Institute. We are in basically a natural montane habitat. This is an aerial view. You can see the institute here in the center. Basically, in the last several years, we have come up with the idea, the concept of rearing or rehabilitation and release of grizzlies. First of all, the idea of wilderness, it needs no dispense. It's been around for years, and it's been discussed numerous times. It's important to our health. It's important to our survival. And we feel that in Alberta, unfortunately, we still have wilderness that we can work with and maintain. Basically, in 2020, the leaders of the world pledged that they would have nature fundamentally underpins human health, well-being, and prosperity. And there was a commitment by the leaders to actually pursue this. This is all high level, way above our heads stuff, but hopefully our politicians and our leaders of the countries believe it, and they actually signed agreements that they believed it. The bears species are key to the health of our habitats ecosystems. These are the charismatic megafauna of many of our environments, and especially in Alberta, where they are revered not only by the population now, but in prehistoric times by the First Nations people, and right through from the first people that came to Alberta till now, bears have been revered. Basically, there's 8 species. God, we have too many experts here in the field of bears, aside from us, and we aren't experts to make a mistake here. There are 8 species of bears in the world, but of those species, many of them are extinct or not extinct, but endangered, at risk. We have bears like the sloth bear, the spectacle bear in northern Canada and other areas of the world, the polar bear, the panda, the Asiatic black bear. But bears are extremely threatened in our world today, and they are threatened in Alberta as well. with the Canadian, just to briefly go over why we're interested in the Canadian legislation. In the 21st century, it's become very obvious that there is a significant crash in the world's biodiversity. This is being reduced at a rate of knots as we progress through the 21st century. Unfortunately, legislation, both provincial and national in the country, lack or trails what actually happens in the environment. And legislation is always the reaction of what's going on to what's going on, not necessarily based on what has happened or is about to happen. So it's not forward-looking, but it's backward-looking. And in Canada, it's a very common thing for legislation to be based on the concept of use, extraction, and exploitation of natural resources, rather than the conservation of natural resources. And because of this, there's no earmarked government funding set aside for ecosystem restoration. That is a debatable point, but I think it can be debated quite successfully in that there isn't any money set aside. There's especially no money set aside for wildlife rehabilitation and release back to the wild. This money is all private money donated from individuals or corporations. So basically, we must depend as a rehabilitation facility and our rehabilitation activities, we must depend on private funding, because we get no funding from the government for rehabilitation and release of wildlife species. The government does, however, control the permits that we receive to actually conduct this work. And the work depends on having suitable permits from the government to do the rehabilitation. Now let's slowly turn to the species that we're concerned with tonight, which is the grizzly bear, North American grizzly bear, or the brown bear, North American brown bear. The decline has been over 50% since the 1800s, and I would tend to say that it's quite a bit higher than 50%, because in the mid 1800s and as prior to and just at European contact with this area, the grizzly bear ranged not only over the area we live in now, but over the entire prairies of North America. Government action has in Alberta is that the bears have been listed as endangered or threatened, and that has always been quite hard to follow sometimes as to what the status of the bear is. The grizzly bears are, but right at the moment it is threatened. The population estimated, and I made a slight mistake here, it wasn't in 2016, it was in 2010, was estimated at 691 grizzly bears in the province of Alberta. Hunting except by landowners on their land, and that's basically for protection of their land, livestock, family, etc., was forbidden. If you had encounters with these bears on your private land, they could be killed. As I said, they now are a species of concern federally and threatened in Alberta, and this is as a result of the latest species at risk and recovery plan and status report on the recovery activities. Human bear interactions are are an emerging and increasing threat to grizzlies. It's one, the interaction between bears and humans is always a significant issue that has to be dealt with. Let's face it, these are massive animals. They can make short work of human beings or any other animal out there in the wild, and it must be considered in any activity that goes on with the animals. Human-caused mortalities, translocation of bears, and other mortalities are quite high, and these are outlined in the Grizzly Bear recovery plans that we'll give you a reference for later on. And you should read them because they are informative. Climate change is also rearing its ugly head in relation to grizzlies. And the government, we have to say, has contributed significantly to identifying what the problems are. We know what the problems are and what the causes of reduction in grizzly bear numbers are. Basically, poaching, accidental collisions with highway vehicles and trains, self-defense kills, whether it's from hunters encountering the bears in hunting activities or on private lands when they were interfering with ranching activities. All these deaths or causes of death have been quite nicely, well documented by the government in research. The other thing is habitat change. And the habitat change because of expanded road networks and habitat destruction because of forestry or oil and gas development, pipeline development, has significantly impacted grizzly populations.
Recreation too.
Recreation activities as well, with more recreation activities in grizzly habitat, and of course that includes 4x4 activity, trail bike activity, and these things increase access to areas that are grizzly habitat that have never been accessed in previous years. Now, when population trends are unknown, and I have to say, I spent the last several months looking for population numbers for bears in Alberta, and the only number that really became available to us was a number that was predicted in the 2010 report of the status of the grizzly bear in Alberta. Now that was 11 years ago, sorry, now. But when population trends are largely unknown, one would think that one should apply, and generally governments say they apply precautionary principle to the management of that species. And from our perspective, and let's face it, we are not government employees. I was a government employee, I was a university employee, I was all sorts of employee, but I'm, the government, if you look at the precautionary principle, you would think that saving every possible bear, especially bear cubs, would be of value. So that's one of the reasons we have come up with our scheme or plan or project to try to persuade the government to approve grizzly bear rehabilitation. Each orphan cub has a very high value in the population of a whole. That's part of the precautionary principle. If you don't know what those numbers are, you shouldn't really afford to lose any of them. We need much better long-term individual-based information. Government tends to be moving, or they tended in the last couple of decades to move towards landscape management of wildlife populations. Landscape management is good, But when you're dealing with endangered species, and we have a table that might explain this a little better shortly, individual-based information is really what you need. And how habitat alteration affects populations. The other thing that may or may not be as important, we have no idea, is gene flow to prevent genetic isolation in populations. Now, we were talking about in I think it was 2020, there were grizzly cubs that were actually taken from the population because the mother was killed and put into a zoo in Vancouver from Alberta. So I was just sitting around musing one day when I was doing this presentation and saying, okay, what did those 3 grizzly cubs mean to the Alberta grizzly bear population? So the best number we had for what the population was from Alberta Sustainable Resource Development in 2010. And that was, there were basically 691 or 700 grizzlies in the province, estimated grizzlies in the province. Now, if we look at how many of those, and these are estimates, models are only as good as the garbage in, garbage out. Remember that. Garbage in, garbage out. But these are the best numbers we could come up with. Half of those bears would have been female. And maybe it would be different a bit, but that means approximately 245 or 345 of the animals of the grizzly bears in Alberta in 2010 would have been female. Now, grizzly bears do not reproduce until they are approximately 4 years old. That varies from 3 up to about 5.5 or so. But I figured, okay, let's say that 70% of those females, 241, would be of breeding age. Now, then we get into using, we have 241 females that could breed in Alberta in 2010. 2010.
Yeah.
Cubs per year. In one of the government report that I've cited at the bottom, which was the best information I could get, and it was very good information. Each cubs per year were 0.2 female cubs per female adult. So that would mean that there would probably be, if there's only 0.2 females, there's probably 0.4 total cubs. In other words, there'd be half female, half male, and that would be 97 cubs in that year produced. Cub survival past year 1 was estimated in the same report to be 0.2 survival, which meant out of that 97 cubs, 17 would survive. Now, that means you're only getting, at the end of year 1 for those cubs, you would have 19 cubs. However, the mortality in the grizzly bear population for a year, for males, the mortality varied for adult males. And this is the thing about grizzlies. If they live to be 1 year old, their survival rate jumps enormously. For reproducing females, their survival rate, or the mortality rate, was 10% to 2%. In other words, anywhere from 90% to 2% or 98% of those females that were of breeding age survived the year. However, it meant that we estimated from the data that 8% of that 691 bears would perish during that year from natural causes, not from human mortality. So what does that mean? there's 19 cubs produced that survived to 1 year. There's 55 adults die out of a population of 651. So somewhere in the area of minus 36 cubs is the population increase. Minus 36 cubs. So that can't go on very long until you see massive changes. So if you want to know what one cub means, you might drop it down in a year to, we know of this year that there were 6 or 7 grizzly cubs euthanized because they weren't brought to a facility for rehabilitation. We probably could have reared and released as healthy subadults into the population, all of those cubs, which would have at least made some difference. Every cub matters. Just for everyone's information, you can check this data in the report that's cited at the bottom of this table. And it does give you an indication how much every cub really matters to the population. I forget what I was doing here, whoops. Alberta's current policy for orphaned grizzly cubs says remove them from the, if a cub is orphaned, in other words, for some reason they find a cub that has no mother, that could be from a rail accident, a highway accident, a hunting incident, whatever. It's an orphaned bear and they prove it. You remove it from the population by zoo placement. So basically that has no more contribution to the natural population. You euthanize it, again, no more contribution to the natural population. Or you abandon it in situ. In other words, leave it for nature to take its course.
Either in a bear management unit or outside the bear management unit.
We felt we had to challenge this policy of the government. One reason the government doesn't really like us much. But we thought we had to challenge it because if there is an opportunity to save those cubs and let them contribute, it's a bad, bad thing in our mind to remove them from that population forever. So our proposal was basically sort of a public-private partnership to research and develop a proper protocol and technique for returning these orphan bears to the wild. We know the policy will work already in many countries of the world. They do this. Russia has a very successful program to collect orphaned brown bear, which is the same as our bear, subspecies possibly, but very similar to the North American brown bear, grizzly bear. They do it in Russia. They do it in some of the European countries. They're especially active in the Balkans, and they have experimented with it in the United States. And BC. We feel that we are presently, well, I shouldn't say that. After this presentation, we may have a change in our bear rehabilitation for next year. But at present, we are permitted to do black bears rehabilitation and release. And when the government gives us species or specimens to work with, we feel doing scientific research on them and augmenting them with grizzly cubs, if we were permitted, would provide a perfect research program to contribute to a successful protocol and methodology development for rehabilitation of the grizzly bears. The other big thing is if a species is extirpated, back in the early 70s, Clio's parents decided they were going to reintroduce the extirpated species of swift fox to Canada. Now, this was not a government thing. This was a private, two very dedicated individuals who said, all our lives, we've lived in nature, we've exploited nature, now we're going to give something back. They chose a swift fox, an extirpated carnivore, a species that had been taken to extinction in Canada. After years of research and years of dedication and millions, well, maybe not millions, probably millions of dollars in being invested, they actually took the swift fox, not only put it on the endangered list, but got it to the threatened list in Alberta. Now that's pretty impressive. And that was a private individual who started that thing, or two individuals. And then Clio took over when her parents passed on in the 70s and 80s and continued the program and moved it into the US and then back into the blood reserve in Canada. And we figure if we can get these species before they're totally gone and bring these orphans and put them back, it is a major contribution and a much cheaper contribution. So what are we planning? And what are the government's concerns? Concern number one was that there's no facility in Alberta capable of rearing orphan brown bears, grizzlies, for release. Our action, we built one. In the summer of 2020, we built a $104,000, 4.5 acre, purposely designed with input from all the major grizzly rehab facilities we could find in the world, input. And we just were fortunate enough to find a funder that would help us. And we built the facility on our property. It's here. So concern number one of the government is not there anymore. Alberta has a facility to do this. Don't have any bears that are being given to us, but we have the facility. So, okay, that's number one. How can I get, oh, and here are just some pictures. We built it between April and September 2020. You can see the outline here. The red lines are actual contour lines. It has a pond. It has a grizzly host rearing facility. Like I say, it's over 4 acres. It has a dedicated 8-foot fence with a 2-foot overhang, electrified wire. It has a 6-foot buried down here. In the bottom picture, you see where the wire is actually buried, but there's a buried ground wire to prevent it from digging out. It is a substantial facility. This is the rearing house for the bears, completely lined in and out with metal, 120 volt power to run the fencer. And anybody who wants to come view it is quite welcome. It's here, it's just waiting. Number two, rearing and release orphan bears might not work in Alberta because there's a lack of data on survival of released animals. True. So we have partnered with Dr. Peter Newhouse, University of Calgary, to lead a program that if we get, and when we get grizzly bears, they will be reared here, they will be followed here, or they will be followed after release, and data will be collected. Now, data will be collected on many, many, many topics, which we need to prove what works and what doesn't work. These pictures you see here is one of our black bear releases. Now, strangely enough, in this trap you see at the top, there were 4 2-year-old black bears that we had reared from bottle feeding cubs. This is our release where we took them out into the bush in a very secure area. This was back in 2011 when we were actually helped by government conservation officers to do our release. They were marvelous help, and they came out, and we take the trap out with the bears in them. We cover it in snow, cover it with bush so it's a little camouflaged, and just open it up, and then the bears go from being asleep at our place to waking up in a wild situation.
What it does is it gives release site fidelity. And that's what you want. If you're going to be letting go, you want to be sure they stay where you put them, because obviously the place you choose to put them is the optimum place. And that's what happens when you do winter releases in this country.
So the third concern, and we say a public concern, they're concerns that were raised by the public and government. There was nowhere in Alberta that orphaned grizzly bear cubs could be released. We took a bit of exception to this. We have worked extensively on many programs with the Kainai, the Blood Tribe down in southern Alberta. They own a very large, what is called the Timber Reserve, right beside Waterton National Park. They are extremely interested in preserving grizzly bears and working with us, because the bear is a spiritual symbol to them, such as the swift fox was a spiritual symbol, or is a spiritual symbol. And that's why they worked with us on swift fox. But also, strangely enough, everybody thinks that oil and gas are anti-environment. Well, they have a few problems. I'm not going to say they're all they're all good things, good problems that they have. But when we release those black bears, the pictures you saw previously, that was a release site on the lands held by Husky Oil near Nordegg, and they contributed the site to us. They said, "Come, release them here." It has reduced access because it's an active producing oil and gas lease. So we aren't so worried about people, the human bear interface. It has controlled, it has controlled access. It's remote. The habitat is suitable for release for food for the bears. It's a wonderful site. So we approached Husky and said, "Look, we're planning this grizzly project. Do you have an interest in coming in with us, possibly providing us with some release sites so that we would have a higher success rate?" Well, unfortunately, we talked to Husky about a month before they joined with Cenovus Energy. But when they got back to us, they said, "Don't worry about the joining with Cenovus. We're in." And just to prove they were in, they sent us a map of lands that are controlled as energy leases in Alberta by Husky and now obviously Cenovus. As you can see, there's a huge amount of land out there that isn't government owned, that isn't privately owned, but it has some controls on it and could develop into really successful release sites. So we feel some of the problems of finding release sites in Alberta are significantly reduced. And we've researched it and tried to make this happen. Another thing that came up was that people of Alberta, and this is a very big topic, people of Alberta might not want orphan bears to be returned anywhere that they might consider it a risk to the people. Now, you can talk about campers, you can talk about other recreational users, you can talk more likely about ranchers, but you can even talk about, extractive industries, oil and gas, forestry. Encounters with grizzly bears are not usually positive things.
I do have to point out
Yeah.
here that for the bulk of bears, initially we would get most of them from Fish and Wildlife. But then when Fish and Wildlife moved out of the role they used to have, we got them from ranchers. So it's not necessary, you can't paint them all with the same brush. Ranchers brought us bear cubs because they cared about them.
And we yeah, it seems a little funny, but that happened. If you talk to some people. Anyway, one of the directors of Cochrane Ecological Institute is Dr. Swann. And we proposed, or Swann proposed, a biosocial approach to the management and release of orphaned bear cubs. Basically, Swann worked extensively with macaques. Now, unfortunately, monkeys aren't bears, but it's the same approach. Macaques had a huge negative, how do we put it? Negative footprint in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, where there were all sorts of thoughts of the local shepherds thought that they were responsible for a lot of sheep killing and derogatory activities relating to the communities. And Swann went in, and through working with the communities and what have you, working with the communities for a while, for a year or so, she discovered that it wasn't the macaques that were doing the damage. It was neighboring communities' dogs that were doing the damage. And she managed to convince the shepherds and what have you in the area of this, and came up with a whole new plan of how you manage macaques and how you manage wildlife. And she worked with us in Montana when we were introducing swift fox there, using similar techniques. And the proposal is that we use a similar approach to the interface between the grizzly bears and environmental users in Alberta. Now, I have to say that there are programs in the southwestern part of Alberta that already have used similar programs for bear management in ranching lands. It's just that they are used in only the one area of southwestern Alberta, and they really, the time has come for a new approach to wildlife management. And we are proposing that we get Swann to use this approach to help us determine what the real public feeling is and whether it's true or untrue about what the impact of grizzlies are. The other part of it is with Swann's work, there is a lot of concentration on citizen scientists and students, and in our case, and in Montana when Swann was working with them, we used a lot of the First Nations people to help collect data and to help with interviews and the interaction between us and the local populations. We plan to use, again, if we manage to get the funding to move ahead with this, there will be a lot of use of the university students citizen scientists to collect data and the tribal peoples who are interested in the bear populations. But in addition, we are planning to investigate several new ways of looking at populations. We have found that at Duke University, they have developed a program called Rfid, which is the footprint identification technology, where you can actually identify species and individuals
Sex.
and sex, was it? Yeah, through footprints. Not an easy thing. We started some work with this year, but we plan to look at a proof of concept to use footprints. Now, people might say, oh, well, that's bullshit. You know, what are you going to do with a footprint? But just think of the idea if you got some bear disturbing a campground or attacking cattle. If you go out and collect footprints in the morning from where the incidents occurred, and you do it several consecutive mornings, chances are very good that you could tell whether it's the same bear, different bears, or what have you. Many, many times in the past, when bears are taken out of the system through euthanasia, because they were a problem bear, it's not necessarily the problem bear that's taken out, because you don't know how many bears actually visited a site. But anyway, just a slight example of how it can be used. But it can also be used on trails and what have you to get an indication of what the population is. The other thing is we're looking at deep learning for wildlife identification using thermal imaging. And this would be done with drones. This is basically counting bears using thermal cameras from drones. Again, a lot of people say, oh yeah, that's pretty flaky. However, it has been researched, and they are doing proof of concept in Australia with koala bears, which are substantially smaller than our brown bear counterparts up here. So that's another research project that we hope to pursue at CEI, and we have been pursuing it. The other one is we have found that radio collars provide good information, but also can be very biased information because of the size of them and how it interferes with the activities of the animal. We have started to look into what they call active RFID tags. That's radio frequency identification. Any of you that have walked out of the store with something and had the buzzer go off at the gate is because that object had a radio frequency ID tag on it. The thing is, those were inactive tags. In other words, there's no batteries or anything in those tags. You have to be a matter of feet away. And that's why you walk through the lawns and it tells whether you're carrying something. These active tags have ranges right now of approximately 300 meters, which could easily be identified with, again, drones flying over an area and give you exact location of the animals. Again, proof of concept to find out what happens. And finally, is using DNA from snow tracks. Now, the only problem with this one is the bears and snow aren't usually together because the bears are asleep. But there are periods in the spring, especially, I mean, the place we saw so much of it was when we were in the British mountains up in the northern Yukon and northern NWT, where the grizzlies are up well before the snow disappears. And you can actually get some pretty good data if you could collect DNA from the snow.
Hi,
So basically that outlines where we plan to go.
What have you got?
What?
Hi, Ken. Sorry.
Yeah.
Is this? Sorry, just for the sake of time,
We're just
we
gonna,
do need to wrap it up a
Yeah.
little. Okay.
I
Thanks,
won't even,
Ken.
oh,
All good. Thank you.
oh, anyway, I was just gonna say, we won't even go over this. What I was about to say was, please don't give up hope. People can change. You can get involved. And obviously, all these people who are watching are involved. And you can make things change. It seems bloody hopeless. As a matter of fact, I almost break down crying some nights, not because of that, but because of COVID and all the other poor things that go on. But please don't give up. Please keep trying. And thank you so very much. Okay, over to you.
Guys.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for your presentation, Ken. I'm just gonna get you to, we'll try and move that. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I was having a few issues with the audio earlier. I had some feedback, and I'm just wondering, can you
Yep.
hear
Yep.
me now?
Everything's good.
Okay, wonderful.
Good.
Excellent. All right. So we'll now begin our question and answer period with both of you. And I'll ask that the audience please submit your questions to us in the chat. So these can be sent to myself or Alex and Sarah, who will then direct your questions to me, and I'll read them aloud for Ken and Clio to answer. We do ask that you please remain respectful in your questions and in the language that you use. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can here. However, any not addressed within the Q&A period will be recorded and posted on our social media along with a recording of this webinar. So without further ado, I'll ask that everyone begin sending in your questions, and we'll get to answering some of those. We don't have a question yet, but someone has just said, thank you very much. Okay. I'll just wait for these to come in. Okay. We have one question here. Someone has asked, is there any way to get directly involved in the Grizzly Bear Rehabilitation project? So, yeah.
Leo.
I think,
I don't know.
yeah.
Depends
Yeah,
on
okay,
where
yeah.
you are and what you want to do. Basically, I think that the ideal, all the wildlife, all the bear people that I've talked to have said that there's not much point in any money that's available should be spent on preserving bear habitat. And they're absolutely right. So it should be. But it's not a private action. And until the government feels that they should move, apart from identifying the problem, they should move to solve the problem. Orphan bear cubs will continue to happen. And so either work towards identifying suitable habitat and trying to get it protected, or say, yeah, we've got to protect the bear cubs and we should be able to rear them and release them and then help us do it.
But the one thing, Jasmine, as you know, and wherever Lisa got to, and actually Paul, is that Paul Smith? Yes. You're all volunteers here. And we need volunteers who can commit to actually productive work. And when the bears are around, there's a fair amount of work just caring for them. But there's also work in the studies, less in the studies because it takes so much more time. but definitely in the animal care. And they should be contacting us directly for that.
Yeah, and I'll have our contact information up
Yeah.
at the end of the this webinar so that people can screenshot that and get in touch with
Okay.
us. So we've got another question here. Someone has asked, how does the proposed or our proposed project compare to what's being done in British Columbia?
What's happening in BC is very similar to what we want to do. Northern Lights has built a bear enclosure and grizzly bear enclosure, and I talked to Angelica Langren about 3 years ago about it to see what input she had, and she told us that the enclosure they had built at that time, and bear in mind it was 3 years ago, was too small. So ours is much bigger. They have got funding, and they have got funding from an outfit in BC to follow up the bears post-release, their grizzly bears post-release. And that's wonderful. And I've talked to Lana, who's doing the work. So BC is doing their thing. We could match what they do. We could compare the data that they have. But the problem in Alberta is it's strictly focused on Alberta. So the Alberta government only wants information on how things work in Alberta. And our program is similar to what's happening in BC, but it will be different in that it's hopefully will happen here.
Okay, we have another question here. Someone has written in saying, can you clarify the role of the federal versus the provincial government's role in natural resource management when it comes to bears? The Aspen Valley Wildlife Sanctuary in Ontario rehabilitated 3 Alberta black bears a few years ago. So can you comment on that?
So I can tell you about those 3 bears if you want, but the thing is that SARA, Species at Risk Act, only affects federal land. So tribal land is responsible, like for the Kainai, tribal land, federal responsibility, national parks, federal responsibility, and and the military land are the federal responsibilities. Outside of those, it's a provincial responsibility. And because bears are terrestrial mammals, they are a provincial. They're not migratory birds, so they're provincial responsibility. So that means what happened with those 3 bear cubs that were found in the toilet in Banff National Park. Banff got hold of us and said, could we take them? I said, yes, we can take them because our facilities are approved by the government. But the government policy is that we cannot accept the bears, that we have approved facilities. So I said, talk to the provincial government and see if the federal bears can come and stay at the CEI until they're old enough for release, when they will go back to the park. There is, in all provinces, and I don't know why, a certain amount of provincial, federal headbutting. Who knows why? So what happened is that the Banff bears had to be flown to Aspen in Ontario at enormous cost, and then they were overwintered. They wouldn't give them a permit. They wouldn't give them permit for them to come here. Provincial government wouldn't give the federal government a permit to bring their bears to us. So they gave them an export permit to send them to Ontario. They overwintered them in Ontario, and they returned them to the park at 18 months old. They collared all of them, and one of them was a real traveler. She went all over the place. The other 2 were laid back types. They just stayed wandered around the park, no problem. The traveling bear traveled in and out of the park. She went down to examine the guys who were working on the buffalo fence in the park. They phoned, radioed in and hazed her. So they chased her away. She never went near any other people after that. But she was eaten by a grizzly bear.
Oh dear.
Well,
That's
nothing to do with her previous life, just one of those things that happened.
Yeah.
It was successful, but we couldn't get the permit to take them, to raise them and put them back from here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question.
So it's a complicated thing.
Yes, the whole thing is rather complicated. We have another question here saying, what is the current response from the Alberta government to CEI's Grizzly Bear project proposal?
Okay. Well, we have, when we developed the plan initially, which was it's approaching 3 years now, we supplied it and we had no comment. We were first in 2017. In 2017, we were asked if we had the capability of, or the interest in doing grizzly cubs by the provincial government. And we said, yes, we did. And we would be more than willing to do it. And that's all we heard. Then we provided our initial study plan to them. We had no comment. Last year, when we were collecting the one bear we had here last year for release, we asked the provincial people who were here on the collection if they wanted to see the grizzly pen, and they said no. And it was 50 meters away from where we were standing. And I hate to bring it up negatively, but they said no, and we said fine. We have since then approached them with the plan and said, please give us your comments. And we've included the plan in this year's application for our wildlife rehabilitation permit. But that comes up at the end of March, so we don't have a response yet.
Okay.
But it's been relatively non-existent, I think is the best way to put it.
We have another question here. I'm going to choose a few of the shorter ones that we can answer in the last 2 minutes before we do the conclusion, and the rest will be responded to on our social media. We'll write a response to you there. We have one here that says, let's see, how many bear cubs can be rehabilitated at one time in the facility that we have at CEI?
I don't think there's any doubt about this. Bear cubs are extremely social little animals. And we have a large area. This is 140 acres. And so I think, and Mike McIntosh, who's got bear with us in Ontario, said so. He said you could easily do 15. At the moment we have, or when they initially issued us the permission in 2018, it was for 10. It's a responsibility of the province to decide.
Now, I have to speak a little bit to Clio's comment. Those were for the black bears, the 10. In Russia, in a pen of the same size, they do approximately 20 brown bears, European browns. So we probably have at least the capacity for 10 black bears and 10 grizzly bears at the same time.
Okay, so I think that is all the time that we have for questions. Once again, we'll be saving the questions that were written in. We had a lot of good ones, and then posting the responses to those on our social media. In the meantime, however, I'm just going to bring this up onto the screen. There we go. Hold on one moment. There. Wonderful. Okay. So can everyone see, can you guys see screen that I'm sharing? Ken and Clio?
Yep.
Okay,
good.
excellent. Okay, so we want to extend a thank you to everyone who has come this evening, who has participated in this discussion about bear rehabilitation. We also want to thank, on behalf of everyone at CEI and everyone at the Pre-Vet Student Association at the U of C, everyone who was attending from a different country, and the government officials who were also here, and any of the university's faculty. We hope that you were able to gain some more insight into the world of grizzly bear conservation, the current legislation surrounding it, and what we can do in the future to preserve and help maintain our bear population for generations to come. So if you'd like, you can take a screenshot of this screen that I'm sharing at the moment. These are all our contacts. These are all the social media links here. And then I have a QR code there if you'd like to support CEI and donate to the work that we do. So thank you so much to everyone for coming. I'll leave that up for a moment. And that's the conclusion of our webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear us? Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, all of you.
No problem. Thank you guys for sharing all your knowledge. And thank you, Sarah and Alex, for collaborating with me to plan this. I really appreciate it.